Yes, so this really goes back to one of the reports that we recently released between the ICMPD and OPAM, and which I was working on. And we were particularly interested in this idea of values when it comes to what makes good migration communication. One of the reasons, firstly, most obviously, is that values are often spoken about. So we looked through 5 or 6 previous reports on how to communicate well on migration issues, because it's such a sensitive subject. The only recommendation that came up in every report that we looked at was to use values. And that's great, but the problem was that no one's really defined what we mean by values in this sense when it comes to communication, at least in the world of migration. So from my background as an academic and as a social scientist, I was already familiar with quite a few different value schema, as they're called in the psychological literature. And one in particular that I've used called Schwartz's basic human values. So psychologist called Schwartz identified 10 values, which he says dictate people's behavior and attitudes to things throughout their life. They're personal values, so they're not explicitly political. And they include universalism, benevolence, security, tradition, conformity, power, achievement, self-direction, hedonism, 1 or 2 others. And these values have been shown to be very good predictors. These personal values have been shown to be very good predictors of all sorts of, as I say, attitudes and behavior, particularly political attitudes and behavior in my case, in the work I've done, and also in terms of attitudes to migration and voting on migration-related issues. 4 of them really have been shown to matter a lot. Universalism, which, i.e. the idea of treating people all the same, has been shown to predict pro-immigration attitudes, whereas conformity, tradition, and security have been repeatedly shown to very well predict anti-immigration attitudes. So if you value these things highly in your own life, you're more likely to be opposed to immigration. What we argue in the latest report, and I've just been going through some experimental evidence that shows this to be the case, is that if we're interested in rebalancing the narrative away from this very sort of strongly anti-immigration rhetoric, rather than use the pro-immigration values, which you might think of, which has been tried a lot, we actually should frame our messaging and speak to those values that have been associated with anti-immigration attitudes, which people in the middle often have, or at least they have a balanced value orientation. Those people who are neither really anti-immigration or pro-immigration, they have a pretty balanced value orientation. But so far, all the messaging has been in terms of universalism. So all we do in the report really is talk about, from an academic point of view, these values, and then show what communicating on migration in terms of conformity, in terms of tradition, in terms of security might look like, how that might look, and how it's likely to be more or less effective. There's a few reasons why it's important to do so. Probably one of the most important nowadays is simply that there's so much demand for good impact assessments. So NGOs, international organizations, whoever it might be, if they're putting in bids to do any kind of campaigns on migration, attitudes to immigration, propensity to emigrate irregularly, all sorts of things, then these projects that are trying to persuade people or trying to affect attitudes or behavior, in the past, you could have simply put in a bid for a grant with an interesting idea. But these days, you really need to show that your work has impact, that it does what it says it's going to do. That isn't, by impact, we don't mean sort of the number of Facebook likes or retweets or shares or whatever it might be. That's more outputs. We also don't mean the number of reports you've made or the number of campaigns you've done. These are all outputs. I'm talking about the actual impact you have on what the project's trying to do. If you're trying to dissuade people from migrating in an irregular fashion, then you need to show that your campaign has that effect. And similarly, if you're trying to rebalance the narrative on attitudes to immigration, you need to show that your campaign ultimately has rebalanced the the narrative. Now, besides the fact that there's just so much demand to do this now, there's also good reasons from a practitioner point of view and from a social scientific point of view. Impact assessment is crucial for making recommendations for the future, for continuously improving on our work by understanding what works and what doesn't work from a practical point of view. And then from a social scientific point of view, a lot of these campaigns speak to deep questions about humanity in terms of our psychology, what is persuasive to us, in terms of sociological or political questions that really answer essentially the nature of man and how he thinks or how he or she behaves. So there's all sorts of reasons, from profound philosophical issues to more practical practitioner issues to do with funding, to do with knowing what works.